me tell you about a man by the name of Roby Laughlin, okay? Now, you don't know Roby. He is my grandfather. And way back in the 1960s, my grandfather gathered with a couple other people, and they figured out we don't have a strong gospel-centered church around us. And so they decided we are going to start one. And they did. And it was an amazing church. People came to know Christ. Many people in my hometown came to know Christ through that church. But something started to happen later on in years. There was this shift that started to take place in the people's minds of the church, and really in my family's mind too. My grandfather was strong in the faith. I mean, he was extremely strong. I've got some aunts and uncles, and I would say that for the most part of their life, they've been semi-strong in the faith. Then you got grandkids. You got those that are my age, my generation. And my goodness, I tell you, I'm in ministry, but there's a whole lot of that generation that is not involved in church at all. They're probably not believers even. And so even as you think about the falling away that has taken place in my family, you think, it's kind of a sad thing. Now maybe you think about your family as the same way. There's been someone in your family who was super strong in their faith, but then as time goes on, it seems like the generations just kind of wane a little bit, don't they? Anybody else experience that in your family? Well, I am thankful as I can be because my mom was passionate about showing me Jesus. But even more than that, she married a man when I was 6 years old who I tell people he was the first picture of the gospel that I ever saw. Because I wasn't his child, but he came into our household and he made me his child. Can you think of anybody else that might have done that? God's done that for us, hasn't he? We weren't his. We were separated from him in our sin, in our state of sin, but yet he came on the picture and he said, I love you. I always have and I always will, and because I love you, I'm going to do what's necessary to restore our relationship. And he did by sending Jesus to die on our behalf. My dad, the man I call my dad, really my stepdad, is the first picture of the gospel that I ever saw. And I fully believe that was what led me to Christ. Led me to want Christ. I'll never forget my Sunday school teacher one day. She's talking about Jesus, and I don't remember what it is that she's telling us. It was a story or something. And she looks across the table at me, and she says, Kivett, do you want to accept Jesus as your Savior? And I said, yes, I do. So she dismissed the whole class, and she pulled me up into her lap, and she walked me through what it looked like to surrender my life to Jesus. And that day, I gave my life to Jesus. I don't know the exact date, but I know I was 6 years old when that happened. And I passed from death to life, kind of like we talked about on Sunday, from darkness into light. Now, God has, throughout my life, taken opportunity to sharpen me, to call me to where I'm at now, to give me an opportunity to serve him. And listen, there is nothing in this world that I would want to do beyond what I'm doing right now. Have the chance to share with others about Jesus, to preach the Word of God. I want to share with you a message tonight that honestly, I've kind of worked through with my church a little bit on this idea of first-generation faith. I told you about my grandfather, Roby Laughlin. He was a man of first-generation faith. There's another man in the Bible that we can consider a man of first-generation faith. So you're in Genesis chapter 12, and I want to go ahead and read for us, starting in verse 1 there, all right? Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1, I'll read through verse 8. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make my name great. And thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. And he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. Now, we're going to talk about Abram here in just a moment. There was I'll tell you a story first of all, and you know this story, but I'll kind of encapsulate it for us. About 2,000 years ago, there was a small group of people who absolutely turned the world upside down. 12 disciples, a few more disciples if you consider the ones that were there. And honestly, the way that they did that was through the simple sharing of a message of good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And they honestly did it in kind of an unconventional way. All they did was wherever they went, they told other people about the good news of Jesus Christ. So as they were going, wherever they were going, they told people about Jesus. Well, at the end of 300 years, there were an estimated 30 million people who had responded to the gospel. Okay, so at the end of 300 years, 30 million people who have responded to the gospel. Now, that is absolutely phenomenal. When you think about the fact they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have internet, they didn't have any kind of mass communication. It was just, hey, me going to Pastor Kirby and telling Pastor Kirby, you need to be saved. I'm just kidding. Pastor Kirby is a great man of God here. But it's me communicating in that way. That's what happened with them sharing the gospel the way that they did. And what God did in that was absolutely phenomenal in exploding the gospel all over the world. The world was turned upside down by those people who were willing to just go and share with someone else what had taken place in their lives. They were people of first generation faith. You know, I think about this church. I think about 10 years ago. There was a group of people who started this church, who planted this church. They were people of first generation faith. Let's look at Abram. Talk about here for a few moments what his first generation faith looked like. Now, as we read through that passage just a moment ago, the first thing that stands out to me about Abram, as I think about his life, is that it seems like Abram could be somewhat of a failure at life. I mean, think about it for a second, okay? When God calls Abram, he's 75 years old right here in this passage. 75 years old. So that's upper middle age in this time period. He's got no children. But yet his name, Abram, means father. Okay? So his name means father, but yet he has no children at 75 years old. Now later on, God is going to call his name Abraham, which means father of many children. But even at that time, Abram is only going to have one illegitimate son in Ishmael. But not only did Abram's name not fit his life, he's a man who was settled in, honestly, a very pagan culture. The land of Ur is a godless place. God is not there at all. The people there had many practices that are ungodly ones. Just an example of that is Abram is actually married to his half-sister. And you know, we look at that today and we go, that's kind of messed up. But that's just kind of a common practice for them in this culture. It's almost like Abram's life is kind of a joke before God calls him. He has a name that didn't fit his life. Evidently, the only woman that he could get to marry him was his half-sister. So you think honestly, this guy didn't really have much of a story at this point. It's safe to say that at this point, when God shows up here in Genesis chapter 12, it's safe to say that Abram, he has wealth. But honestly, he had a complete lack of fulfillment in his life beyond that. Now, how many of you feel like that could be your story? You know what? I got a few things in life, but you know what? I just don't feel fulfilled or feel significant in life. The interesting thing with Abraham here is that God comes to him and he tells him that he's going to take Abram's insignificant, even failure of a life, and he is going to give him a purpose and a calling unlike anything else that he could ever experience. So look at verse 1 with me. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Folks, this is the moment of truth for Abram. God comes to him and he just simply says, Go. right? Just go. There's a whole lot about what we can learn about God here from this, all right? And here's the first thing. God doesn't tell Abram where he's going to go. Did you catch that? He didn't tell Abram where he's going to go. All God says is that he's going to show Abram where he's going to go. Nothing more. We know because we know the end of the story that God is leading Abram to Canaan, but at this point, Abram doesn't know any of that. His obedience here is not based on a knowledge of where God's going to take him. It's based on trust and surrendering to God. Now, we can learn a whole lot, really, from the example that we see here in Abram, and the fact that he simply obeys, even though he doesn't have that final destination in mind. He has no idea where he's going. Now, here's a question for us. Are we willing to follow God no matter where God takes us, even when we don't know where he's going to take us? God speaks, are we willing to respond with obedience? All right, here's the next thing that we find out. Is that God doesn't give Abram details on how to get there. So not only does he not say, hey, Abram, you're going to this place. He didn't do any of that. No, he didn't even give details on how Abram is supposed to get there. So Abram doesn't know, hey, am I going to a cold climate where I need to pack some really warm clothes? Or am I going to a hot climate where I need to pack some clothes where, you know what, I'll be a little more comfortable? He didn't give him any details at all. But what does Abram do? He goes, right? Folks, the most important thing that we can ever do is respond in faith with obedience when God calls us to go. But what we have to also understand is that God never calls without a promise. God never calls without also giving a promise. There's always a promise that comes with any calling that God gives. Here's 4 promises that God gave Abraham right here. All right, number 1, God would make of Abram a great nation. He said, I will make of you a great nation. That's not going to happen during Abram's lifetime, but it very generously came to pass down the road. You might remember from maybe Pastor Kirby teaching you or your Bible reading that Abram had a son by the name of Isaac. Isaac had a son by the name of Jacob, and from Jacob comes 12 sons who end up being the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel, and from those 12 tribes comes literally millions, if not at this point, billions of people. So God would make of Abram a great nation. Number 2, God would bless Abram and make his name great. Even today, Abraham is touted as the father of the Jewish nation. There are literally, like I said before, billions of people who over the past 4,000 years have known the name of Abraham, and they can trace their roots back to him as their forefather. God's promise to Abram to make his name great is something that's been fulfilled over time. Okay, number 3, here's the third promise, that God would bless those who bless Abram and curse those who curse him. There's a commentator who actually wrote on this passage by the name of Cecil Sherman, and here's what he had to say. God will condition his blessings and cursings on the way people react to Abraham's descendants. Now, for thousands of years, we have seen this come true. God blesses the people, nations who bless the nation of Israel, who love them, who work hand in hand with him, and God curses the nations, the people who curse the nation of Israel. God's blessing has been on the nation of Israel all along. His plan is centered on the nation of Israel, and it will continue to be centered on the nation of Israel moving forward. There's no point in all of history or in the future in which God is going to be done with the nation of Israel. There is people, there is chosen people. God chooses to honor them and anyone else who blesses them. Number 4, God would, by Abram, bless all the families of the earth. God would, by Abram, bless all the families of the earth. Now, folks, that's not something that is realized until Jesus came to earth and died. He didn't just die for the Jews, though, for the Israelites, for the Hebrews. He died for the Gentiles as well. Jesus died for everyone who lives. Jesus is the one that God is going to use to bless all the families of the earth with salvation. Jesus was actually, he was born in the line of Abraham. One day, every single person from every tribe and tongue is going to have the opportunity to be blessed by the salvation that Jesus has to offer. We experience that now. Anytime here in the church age, everybody has the opportunity to respond to the gospel. Everyone has the opportunity to be blessed by Abraham and his line. God never, ever, ever calls without a promise. There's 4 promises he gave Abram right there. Folks, He is not going to call you to do something without also giving you a promise. He's never going to call you to do something without also giving you a promise. And if nothing else, listen, if nothing else, even if that promise isn't great wealth, right? It's not necessarily God going to promise you with great wealth. He's not going to promise you necessarily with great health. He's not going to promise you necessarily that He's going to make your name great. Now, He might make your name great in order to put you on a platform so you can make His name great. He might do that. But God doesn't necessarily promise those things to us today. God's promise is rarely those things, actually. But you know what His promise is? Think about this for a second. Think about some of the things that Jesus said before He left this earth to go to heaven. I remember one of the promises is that Jesus said, I'm never going to leave you and I'm never going to forsake you. Right? Didn't He promise to send a helper? Right? Well, He said, I'm going away. Oh, but the helper's going to come and He's going to be with you. He's going to indwell you. Holy Spirit. God never calls us to something without also accompanying a promise with it. Look at verse 4 with me. The calling has come to Abram. The promises have been given to Abram. So what does Abram do? Verse 3 words. So Abram departed. I love that. God's called. God's given some promises. What does Abraham do? He departs. He goes. Continuing on verse 4. As the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. We then continue to read that there was some others that came with Abram. Abram passed through the land into the place of Sichem, into the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. Folks, that was really simple, wasn't it? So Abram went. But not only did he go, but he went as the Lord had told him. So what God said to do, Abram did. In the way that God said to do it, Abram obeyed. Folks, there is something about the faith of Abram that is absolutely incredible. And if you ever want an example of what your faith should look like, you can look no further than this right here. Honestly. When God calls, Abram simply goes. Martin Luther was the reformer that lived back 1500s. He says this: faith is a living, bold trust in God's grace. So certain of God's favor that it would risk death 1,000 times trusting in it. Such confidence and knowledge of God's grace makes you ever joyful and bold in your relationship to God and all creatures. Because of it, you freely, willingly, and joyfully do good to everyone, serve everyone, suffer all kinds of things, love and praise the God who has shown you such grace. Folks, if there is anyone that this quote from Luther describes, it would be Abram. As he trusted God, he responded when God called. His faith was a living, bold trust in God's grace. Abram had faith to do exactly what God had commanded him to do. Okay? So this is the faith of Abraham, though. God calls. God gives the promises. Abram goes. This is the faith of Abraham. But here's a sad thing. As time goes on, you start to see it with Isaac a little bit. Then you see it with Jacob. Then as you get on down into Jacob's descendants, Jacob's children, you see more and more this moving away from this first generation type faith. You see a moving away from this bold, trusting faith. I want to show you a difference between first generation faith and second generation faith. Okay, look up here on the screen with me for a minute. On the left side, you may have trouble seeing it, so I'm going to read it for you, okay? On the left side, you have what first generation faith looks like. Right side, second generation faith. First of all, first generation faith does whatever it takes. You know what? This floor needs to be swept. I'm going to go do that. Right? Second generation faith, on the other hand, says it only does what I'm asked to do. You know, I'm only going to do that if somebody else asks me to do this. First generation faith assumes personal responsibility. Second generation assumes someone else is going to do it. First generation expects personal sacrifice. Second generation expects personal comfort. Have y'all seen that before? You know what? I expect to have to sacrifice something in order for God's will to be carried out. But then you get on into second generation faith a little bit later down the road somewhere. Maybe it's a family descendant. Maybe, honestly, as a church grows older, this mindset starts to creep in and says, you know what, I'm expecting personal comfort a little bit more than personal sacrifice. First generation sees problems and seeks solutions. Second generation sees problems and they complain. Right? I don't like the fact that yada, 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 yada. Oh, but that first generation, they said, you know what? I see a problem. I'm going to see if I can find a solution to this. First generation sees possibilities and dreams about what could be. Oh, God, what might you want to do with this church? God, what might you want to do with my family? God, what might you want to do with my life? Oh, but the second generation sees barriers, and they see those barriers as a reason to quit. Yeah? First generation hears the voice of God firsthand, and they own the vision. The vision, a Christian school, right back here behind the church, where we can raise up young people with a Christian, a biblical worldview. The second generation inherits the vision secondhand, and they start questioning every decision. I'm not too sure that's the right thing to do. Are you sure about that? First generation steps out with bold, reckless trust in God. Second generation sits satisfied in the stability of the institution. That first generation says, you know what, I'm willing to risk. Well, that second generation oftentimes says, you know what, I'm more comfortable with the stability. Let's do what makes sense rather than the decision of faith. Right? First generation fears holding anything back from God. In other words, God, I don't want to hold anything back from you. I want you to do anything and everything that you want to do. But the second generation fears commitment. Right? First generation feels privileged to be a part of the movement. Do you see what God is doing here? You feel privileged. Oh man, I get to be a part of this. Second generation feels entitled to the benefits of the institution. What can my church give me? What can my church do for me? You see the differences there? And this is exactly what starts to happen in the life of Abram. Abram has that first generation type faith where he's willing to risk it all, willing to go for it. But that second generation, they start to feel more comfortable with, I like this land. I like what I've got here. Let me just kind of huddle up and protect myself. If we're not careful, then we will do the exact same thing. Folks, God never, ever, ever, ever calls his people to second generation type faith. Ever. He calls us all to bold, trusting faith. So church, Grace Community Baptist Church, as I think about first generation faith and I think about what that means for you, I believe that it means that you continue to step out in faith in ways that are sometimes different or sometimes difficult. Specifically, as I think about this, I wonder what God might be calling you as a church to do to advance his kingdom. I firmly believe that you've been strategically placed here by God to make a dent in reaching the lost with the gospel. There is a huge number of people all around you who don't know Jesus. You have been placed here as a church to reach those people. God has placed you as a church here to reach these people. What might happen if you raised up pastors here in this church to send them out and to shepherd other churches, where those other churches can join with you in reaching those people? Right? Jesus' command is to take the gospel to Jerusalem, to Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. So here's just a question for you. What would it look like for you to launch out more pastors and missionaries and teachers and people who serve in the church in the next 10 years, more than you have in the last 10 years? What would that look like? That'd be pretty cool, wouldn't it? Launch these people out so they can go share the gospel. Your pastor's got a vision for a Christian school. I mentioned that just a moment ago. You have a vision for a Christian school. It's an opportunity for kids to be taught in a school of biblical worldview. Those kids are one day going to be the people who take the gospel to whatever workplace God may call them to. God's going to raise some of them up to be those pastors, maybe to be those missionaries, to be those people who serve him in full-time Christian service. What if you, as a church, were fully committed to doing everything that you could to invite the unchurched into this place where they can have the opportunity to hear the gospel, to hear that there's a God who loves them, a God who always has and always will. If we're going to reach people with the gospel, it's going to have to come through a first generation like faith and not a second generation like faith. Over and over again, I'm being struck with the reality that God has not taken his hand of blessing off of the church. And I use the big C there, so universal church. His calling for us to reach people has not changed in any way. That's still what he's calling us to do, every one of us. But he wants to use us with the first generation faith that Abram had when God called him. Abram laid it all on the altar. He's like, hey, here I am. You can have all of me. You can have all of my family. You can have all of my possessions. You can have every bit of what is comfortable to me. He said, I'll give it all up to follow God. He didn't do so begrudgingly. Oh, man, seriously? I got to do this? God, why would you do this to me? Why would you call me to go to that neighbor that I really, honestly have a difficult time with? No. He joyfully went. Joyfully followed God. He didn't fight with God. He didn't question God or with a desire for personal comfort or, you know what, I really would rather build myself up. He didn't say, you know what, I'm just going to do what I want to do. No, he went when God called him to go. Now, you really think about it, there's other times that Abram actually does a really bad job of following God. A couple of times in his life. He just made some horrible decisions, didn't he? You know, we're going to do that sometimes. We're going to make some bad decisions. We're not always going to be faithful to God. But we always come back to that bold, trusting faith in God. God, what would you want me to do? How would you want me to live? How would you want our church to move forward? I love what Romans chapter 4, verse 3 says. Abraham believed God. Believed God. And it was counted to him as righteousness. Abraham believed God, and God looked on him as righteous because he believed God. Folks, what do you believe God for? And is what you believe God for consistent with the promises that he's made and the calling that he's got on your life? Here's some examples. Do you believe God when you read that you are his workmanship created in Christ Jesus for good works? Do you believe God has set you apart as righteous because of your salvation? Do you, as an individual, believe God has called you out of your state of sin and into a personal relationship with his son, Jesus? Do you believe God when he told you that he would never leave you or forsake you and that he would send a helper who would embody the very presence of God in your life? Do you believe God has given you a calling to proclaim his glory all over the earth by sharing Jesus with everybody you come in contact with? Hey, let's pause here for a second, okay? Let's pause here. Do you realize that at some point you could share the gospel with someone who takes the gospel to an unreached people group somewhere else, and that whole people group comes to know Christ because you shared the gospel with this person and that person acted in obedience and took the gospel to that people? You realize that? God's just calling us to, in faith, respond, to be bold in our response, in our trust of him. Do you believe God when God is calling you out of every comfort zone that you have ever built for yourself? Because sometimes we do build this comfort zone around us. You know what? I'm good right in here. Don't really mess with me beyond this. Do you believe God? There's a man by the name of Frederick Brotherton Meyer who once wrote about Abraham. And in his book, he wrote this, and I want to close with this thought. He says, the keynote of Abram's life was separation. Step by step, until country, kindred, lot, worldly alliances, and fleshly expedients were one by one cast aside, and he stood alone with God. Though he knew not whither he went, the father of the faithful obeyed and crossed the wide and perilous deserts. It was this absolute and unquestioning obedience that endeared him to God. Let us ever obey and step out, though it seems as though there were naught but seething mist. We shall find it solidify under the tread of faith. Folks, will you be a person of first generation faith? That's really the question I wanted to come to you with tonight. Will you be a person of first generation faith? group of people in this room could absolutely change Kingstown Park. You realize that? With first-generation faith, the people in this room could absolutely, radically change Kingstown Park. I fully believe that. Will you be a person of first-generation faith? It would require you to step out and say, God, I don't know what I'm in for, but I'm in regardless. It might cost me everything that I hold dear, but I am in. Sign me up. I'm answering the call. So here in closing, what I want to do is actually put this table back up here on the screen for you, okay? And you can kind of read through that a little bit and just remind yourself, this is what first-generation faith looks like. This is what second-generation faith looks like. And ask yourself, am I willing to be a person of first-generation faith? All right, so I'm just going to let it sit here for just a second, okay? You look at that, and then I'll close with a thought here in just a moment. Here's the challenge I want to close with. Sometimes we look at a chart such as this and we look at, you know what? I want to be that. I want to be that person of first-generation faith. But we think, I don't really know how on a practical basis. So I want to challenge you, if that's you and you think, I don't really know what that means for me, I want you to call Pastor Kirby. And he would love to show you what it might look like for you in your life to be a person of first-generation faith. I'm sure he would love to sit down with you and say, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what it looks like. God never, ever, 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 ever calls us to second-generation faith. He always calls us to bold, trusting faith. First-generation type faith.